Hey, welcome! Today we're taking a pretty big leap. We're going from just practicing Kubernetes on your own computer to really understanding how the pros manage these massive, real-world clusters out in production. And we're going to do it by looking at a super powerful tool called KOPS. Let's jump in. So picture this. You're in that DevOps job interview you really want. The hiring manager leans forward and asks, "So tell me about your experience with production Kubernetes." That's the moment, right? It's what separates the people just learning from the people who are getting hired. And trust me, by the end of this, you are going to have a rock-solid answer. All right, first things first. We have to talk about why the tools you've probably been using to learn Kubernetes, well, they aren't what you'll find running at a big company. It's time to move beyond the playground. And this slide really shows you that split. Over on the left, you've got these fantastic learning tools. Minikube, K3s, Kind. They are absolutely perfect for getting your hands dirty and for local development. But that's all they are, development setups. They just don't have the high availability, the scalability, or the enterprise support that production systems absolutely must have. So if it's not Minikube, then what are companies actually using? In this next section, we're going to map out the real landscape of Kubernetes systems that you'll find out there in the wild. The one key idea you really need to get is this thing called a Kubernetes distribution. You see, just like with a lot of open source software, the raw code is only the starting point. A distribution takes that foundation and wraps it all up with cool enhancements, extra tools, and, this is crucial, enterprise support. The best way to think about this is to compare it to Linux. Think of open source Kubernetes as the core Linux kernel. It's incredibly powerful, but pretty bare bones. And then you have distributions like Ubuntu or Red Hat that build on top of that kernel, right? They add user-friendly features, package managers, and commercial support. Well, Kubernetes works exactly the same way. So in the real world, these distributions basically fall into three main groups. First, you've got the managed services from the big cloud providers, like Amazon's EKS or Google's GKE. They do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Second, you have enterprise distributions like OpenShift and Rancher, which offer their own unique user experience and tools. And third, there's self-managed open source Kubernetes, which, gives you the most control, but also makes you responsible for everything. And that brings us to the hero of our story today, KOPS. It actually stands for Kubernetes Operations. It's the absolute go-to tool for that third category we just talked about, helping engineers expertly manage their own self-hosted Kubernetes clusters, especially on cloud platforms like AWS. Now, what's so important to understand is that KOPS is not just some installer. It's a complete lifecycle management tool. It handles the whole shebang from the initial creation and setup of a cluster all the way through those complex upgrades, any changes you need to make, and even deleting it when you're done. And this is where KOPS really shines, especially when you compare it to a more basic tool like kubeadmin. Kubeadmin is great for getting a cluster started, but what about ongoing management? Things like upgrades? That becomes a very manual and honestly a very tricky process. KOPS was designed from day one to make those kinds of operations smooth and repeatable. Let's break down its superpowers real quick. We've talked about lifecycle management. Another huge feature is how it stores your entire cluster configuration, your single source of truth, in a cloud storage bucket like AWS S3. This makes your whole setup declarative and reproducible. And because it's so deeply integrated with the cloud, it knows exactly how to provision all the right resources for you. Okay, enough theory. Let's see how this thing actually works. We're now going to walk through the main steps for building your very first production-style cluster on AWS using KOPS. Every quest needs some prep work. Before you can even dream of building a cluster, you need to get your tools ready. That means installing Python 3, the AWS command line interface, and of course, kubectl. And, most importantly, you'll need an AWS user account that has the right permissions to let KOPS do its thing. And hey, these are not small permissions. KOPS needs full access to create virtual machines on EC2, S3 buckets for that state store we talked about, IAM roles for the machines, and all the VPC networking stuff. You're basically giving it the keys to build an entire city, so it needs the authority to pour the concrete and lay the foundations. Next up, you create a dedicated S3 bucket. This is probably the most important prerequisite. This little bucket becomes the central vault, the brain of the whole operation, where KOPS keeps all the configuration and state information about your cluster. And now for the really cool part. You run the KOPS create cluster command. What's so amazing here is that this command doesn't actually build anything yet. Nope, it just generates the complete blueprint for your cluster. How many nodes, what size machines, all the network settings, and it saves that whole configuration right into your S3 bucket. Oh, and here's a super useful pro tip. For testing, KOPS lets you use a special .k8s.local suffix. This is awesome because it lets you avoid any real domain name or DNS costs. But, of course, in a real production environment, you would point this to a proper domain that you own and manage in a service like AWS Route 53. So, with the blueprint saved in S3 and everything looking good, you give the final command. KOPS, update cluster, yes. And this is the moment of truth. KOPS reads that perfect configuration from S3 and starts provisioning everything it needs on AWS. The EC2 instances, the EBS volumes, the security groups, the whole deal to bring your cluster to life. And just like that, your cluster is up and running. But before we start celebrating, we have to talk about the most important real-world factor of them all, the cost. Seriously, I cannot stress this enough. This is not Minikube running on your laptop for free. KOPS is creating real infrastructure in the cloud. Those EC2 instances, those storage volumes, you get a bill for every single one of them. So when you're just playing around, please be mindful of the cost and always tear down your cluster when you're finished. So let's bring it all home. What's the big takeaway here? It's simple, really. Use tools like Minikube to learn the core concepts of Kubernetes. Pods, services, deployments. But to really understand and speak confidently about how companies run it in production, and to absolutely nail that job interview, you need to understand tools like KOPS. So we've given you the blueprint for how to go from a simple playground to architecting a real cluster city. The tools and the concepts, they're in your hands now. The only question left is what kind of amazing things are you gonna build? Thanks so much for joining me today.